Good evening. I am Brent Reedy. I'm the Andrew W. Mellon Director of the Research Libraries. Hello. Try that again. Hi, I'm Brent Reedy. I'm the Andrew W. Mellon Director of the Research Libraries here at the New York Public Library. Whether you are in this room or out there watching from afar, we are so very happy to have you here tonight. It's such an honor to have Christian McBride and Nelson George here. I am at this library by way of a degree in music history. I went to college, though, not to study music history, to study jazz piano. It was in the freshman year I fell in love with jazz, and then in the senior year I realized I got good enough to know I wasn't good enough, and history was my backup plan. So I'm here as a failed jazz pianist. But those years in college and the years since, I spent more than 1,000 hours listening to recordings of Christian. Whether it's his early work with Freddie Hubbard and Hank Jones, to recordings that just came out a couple years ago, including the re-release of the incredible 1998, The Movement Revisited, which you can buy over there on vinyl or as a CD on your way out tonight. For those who do not know that album, it is a portrait dedicated to 4 key figures in the civil rights movement: Martin Luther King Jr., Muhammad Ali, Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X. That unique blend of music and history is why this program is perfect to be here tonight and perfect for our institution. Here at NYPL, we are proud to hold vital collections in which you can trace some of the stories that are in this recording. The Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, 135th Street, is home to the papers of Malcolm X himself. They also hold vital collections of intimate allies and colleagues of Dr. King, including the great Harry Belafonte, who is also the namesake for 115th Street branch, and the papers of King's first biographer, Lawrence D. Reddick. On the music front at the Library for the Performing Arts, we have an unparalleled collection of music history, including jazz greats, people like Leroy Jenkins, Marco Rizzo, Henry Grimes, George Avakian. The list goes on and on. All of this is freely accessible to scholars, to anyone, as long as they have a library card. And I can't imagine a better interlocutor tonight than Nelson George. His work as a critic, a writer, and a filmmaker is extraordinary. If you haven't, go read The Death of Rhythm and Blues or one of the other, 24 books or films that he is behind. He's also been hanging out at the Schomburg Center doing some work with the Sonny Rollins papers, from what I hear. So that's probably a subject for a future program here. Before we begin, a few quick announcements. First, I am thrilled that we are going to be kicking off at the Schomburg Center in just a couple weeks, the 32nd Annual Women in Jazz Festival. Every Monday night at the Schomburg Center, there's a different program. It's going to kick off with the Gospel According to Nikki Giovanni. It explores, let's give Nikki a round of applause. It explores an historic collaboration between jazz messenger, saxophonist, composer Javon Jackson and the renowned poet, activist, and educator Nikki Giovanni, and the partnership and exploration of the overlap of jazz and gospel music. Meanwhile, in this very room and elsewhere, we have an incredible array of live programs live from NYPL. Too many to mention, but a few highlights: Maggie Haberman, Lynn Slater, Marilyn Robinson, the former Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, all free, all for you. Tune in, come watch, go to nypl.org/live, learn more. Christian and Nelson are ready and excited to take your questions at the end of this program. For those of you in the room, you might have sitting on a note card and tiny pencil when you came in. Write down your questions. My colleagues are going to circulate through the room during the evening to take your questions from you. If you are tuning in at home, just drop that question in the chat field or email it to publicprograms@nypl.org, and we'll take as many of your questions as we can. With no further ado, please welcome Christian McBride and Nelson George. Yeah.
Hello, New York, how are you? Sound like you're in good voice. So tonight we're going to talk about music and culture and protest and identity and how those things interact and have interacted in American music, music made by Black American musicians, going back as far back as almost the beginning of the last century. We have a playlist of songs that are up on Spotify. We're going to play bits and pieces of some of the music tonight. Obviously not the whole songs. Some of the pieces we're playing are 45 minutes long, so we're not going to play that. But we're not going to obviously talk about every song, even on our playlist. So just be aware of that. It's on Spotify. And also, Christian and I want to make clear, this is not a definitive list of protest social commentary songs. They're songs that we're interested in and I think relate to the theme of tonight. And the theme of tonight is this album, The Movement Revisited by Christian McBride. So instead of talking first, we're going to play some music. We're going to play track number 12, Sister Rosa, from The Movement Revisited. So this project has been something you've been working on since the 90s.
That's correct.
So let's talk about the genesis of it and then how it's evolved over time.
Well, first of all, if you will allow me, hello, New York. It's great to see you. It was good. If you will allow me to dote on you for a second,
no, come on, man.
Because you are one of my heroes. I've been a big fan of yours as a writer, as a filmmaker, as an intellectual for a lot of years. So it's an honor to sit up here with you tonight, my man. Thanks for doing this.
No problem.
And I also have to applaud you on what I believe the Thriller 40 is your most recent work, right? Yeah. Have you all seen that? The documentary on Michael Jackson's Thriller? This man here.
It's on Paramount Plus, so there's no reason for you to have seen it.
Yeah, anyway, getting back to The Movement Revisited, I received a commission in 1998 from the Portland, Maine Art Society, and they were doing some Black History Month programming, and they said, we would like to have you write an extended work. And that was the first time anyone had asked me to do that. And part of the stipulation of the commission was that it had to involve a gospel choir. And for that reason, I almost turned it down because I had no experience writing long form extended works, much less involving any choral, any chorus. And I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not sure if I could do this. So they introduced me to the great J.D. Steele, whose family, the Steeles, in the gospel world, their they're right up there with the Winans, you know, a royal family out of Minneapolis. And so I met JD, and JD became my co-pilot in writing this piece. I said, JD, I don't know what I'm doing when it comes to the choir. He says, it's okay, I got that. Just sing anything, write anything, I will turn it into music. And so when I was trying to figure out what the sort of what would the focus of the piece be, I didn't know if it was going to be a person, a place, an event, a time period. And so just like we were talking backstage, one thing that really was an integral part of my entire life, as is the case with all African Americans of a certain generation, certain number of generations, is Jet and Ebony magazine. And my grandmother saved a lot of old Ebony and Jet magazines from the 50s and 60s. So I grew up reading those old magazines, being absolutely fascinated with contemporaneous accounts of things that were historic. And it just became fascinating to me. And four people that really became sort of important to me were Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, and of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So that's where the title comes from, The Movement Revisited, a musical portrait of four icons. And so we played these concerts in 1998 with a small group in a choir. And 10 years later, in 2008, I was the creative chair for jazz programming with the LA Phil. And my boss at the time, Laura Connolly, she said, hey, I read somewhere that you wrote a piece called The Movement Revisited. What is that? You could think of this as two ways. You can think of it as thinking on my feet, or you could think of it as lying. So I told Laura, I said, yeah, that's, you got the resources of the LA Philharmonic. That's a piece I wrote for a big band and a mass choir and four narrators. And I thought she was going to say no. And, you know, Laura said, that sounds interesting. Let's do it. So now I backed myself into a corner with my own lie, and I had to rewrite The Movement Revisited from scratch. So I wrote it as a big band piece, and this is what you hear here. And so that was, we played it at Walt Disney Concert Hall in May of 2008. Of course, Barack Obama gets elected president in November of 2008. And The Movement Revisited had already been booked to play the following February in Detroit. And the artistic director of the festival at that time, Terry Pontrelli, said, hey, what if I give you some extra bread to write a new movement, add a new movement to the movement? And so that's where the fifth and final movement came. It's called Apotheosis, November 4th, 2008. So it's not for Obama, but it's for that night. And that's the story of the album.
Why don't you talk a little bit about how you feel, because your album is part of a legacy.
Yes.
And a lineage.
Yeah.
How do you see, what are the pieces that inspired you?
Oh, I've been a big fan of extended compositions by so many musicians, particularly in jazz, because I still feel like people don't really understand the legacy of jazz composers who have sat down and meticulously thought of a beginning, a middle, and an end to, like, you know, the same way Bach and Beethoven and Mozart wrote pieces. You know, our first great composer like that was Duke Ellington. And you can't overstate the importance of Ellington. And so his Black, Brown, and Beige was very important to me. Max Roach's Freedom Now. Let's play that.
Let's have a little bit of cut number one, Duke Ellington, Black, Brown, and Beige.
Lord, dear Lord of love, God God up above, please look down and see my people through. God, dear God of love, God Almighty, God above, please look down and see my people through.
So let's talk about that piece.
Yes,
It debuted at Carnegie Hall.
1943. Yes.
So talk a bit about the context of that.
Yeah. Well, there's an infamous interview where Duke Ellington was interviewed by, I believe, I can't remember what news. It was like a black radical newspaper from like the late 60s. And someone asked Duke Ellington, said, well, Mr. Ellington, how come you don't write music for the movement, for the cause, you know? And Duke, in his inimitable, classy, elegant way, says, well, son, I addressed these issues 30 years ago, you know, with a piece that you may or may not know called Black, Brown, and Beige. And when he played this at Carnegie Hall, when it debuted at Carnegie Hall in 1943, he made a little speech before they went into the music, and he said, this is my portrait of the Negro experience in America. And to an all-white audience at Carnegie Hall in 1943, that's what you call woke. And a lot of people may not realize that song, Come Sunday, is part of the larger Black, Brown, and Beige suite, which he recorded many years later.
In 58.
In 58 with Mahalia Jackson.
Yeah.
And so if you can find yourself to the original 1943 Carnegie Hall concert, it's absolutely fascinating. So that's one of the main pieces that inspired the movement Revisited.
I just want to say, one of the things that really fascinated me in revisiting this material was the use of the word black.
Mm-hmm.
Consistently, so black didn't become the primary description of black, of our self-identification till the 60s.
Right.
You know, we can talk about James Brown and say that I'm black and I'm proud, but it was happening in that era. You go back and Black and Tan Fantasy is 1927.
Yes.
Now we're talking 1943. So he was using black
Duke
as
was so
identification,
far ahead of his time. It's crazy.
you know, way before it was, because black folks in general were not necessarily embracing
That's right.
black. I grew up as colored and then I became Negro
Exactly.
before I got to be black.
Yeah.
And Duke was using this kind of phraseology to identify our experience in this country.
That's right.
Way before it was fashionable.
Yes.
So it's quite striking. Now we're going to talk about, you alluded to Max Roach. I want to read something that sets up the Max Roach piece. He said this in around 1960. We American jazz musicians of African descent have proved beyond all doubt that we're master musicians of our instruments. Now what we have to do is employ all our skill to tell the dramatic story of our people and what they've been through.
Yeah, amen.
So I think the next track we'll play is number 3. It's Max Roach, Drive a Man from We Insist.
That's right.
The album We Insist.
Drive a man, he made a life, but the mammy ain't his wife. Chopping cotton, don't be slow. Better finish out your row. Keep a moving with that plow. Drive a man'll show you how. Get to work and root that stump. Drive a man'll make you jump. Better make your hammer ring. Drive a man'll start to swing. Ain't but two things on my mind. Drive a man and quitting time.
Oh, shit.
Yeah, no.
Oh, wow.
No, that's cool. That's
Okay.
cool.
So this particular suite of songs, there's 5 selections in this We Insist, also known as the Freedom Suite.
Yes. Freedom Now, sweet.
Freedom,
Yeah.
right. And so let's talk a little bit about the conception of this. This was a collaboration initially between Max Roach, the great drummer, and Oscar Brown
and
Jr.
Oscar Brown Jr., right. And also we should give a very special shout out to his then wife, the late great Abby Lincoln. It's interesting how stories kind of, like Nina Simone has gotten hot all over again.
Right.
There's been a young generation that, thank goodness, has really understood and have gone to revisit the legacy of Nina Simone. But in that, maybe a lot have missed the legacy of Abby Lincoln, because she was just as radical and outspoken as Nina Simone was.
Absolutely.
And in terms of a power couple, no one was more powerful than Max Roach and Abby Lincoln in the 60s. So with that, Max and his dear friend, Sonny Rollins, they were sort of the next generation after Duke Ellington to make very pointed statements about what they saw in our community and things that were going on within the black community with racism and
Yeah,
things.
Sonny
like
did
that.
an album in '58 called Freedom Suite. So
Yes.
again, they're both responding to what's happening in the South.
That's
and
right.
giving musical voice to it.
Long before, we talked about this as well, but I think that to a more popular culture, we think of protest music as something that happened in the mid to late 60s with soul music. Jazz musicians were way ahead in terms of freedom music and protest music. But once Max did the Freedom Now suite, he pretty much dedicated the rest of his life to making protest music, and he practiced what he preached.
Absolutely.
I was very, very fortunate to get to work with him. Well, almost. It's a long story, but I was scheduled to play with Max at the 92nd Street Y back in the late 90s, and Max had a little tiff with the promoter. So we had a great rehearsal, but the concert never happened. So I did get to play with Max at rehearsal. So yes, but yes, Max always practiced what he preached.
So a few things to mention. This is the 100th, this is centennial this
Yes.
year. Max would have been 100 years old in January. There's an excellent documentary on PBS about him called The Drummer Waltz.
The drum also waltzes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And one thing I want to mention about this album that really struck me as I revisited it again is how prescient it was about Africa.
Yes.
The last song on the album is called Tears from Johannesburg.
Yeah.
So this is a song about apartheid in Johannesburg in 1960. So he was very global.
He was on it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so again, it's another example of how the musicians were not only leading, but way ahead of the curve of, because again, another thing to contextualize is that even in the 60s, while there was talk about the Afro and Black pride, the connection between Africa
Yes.
and the U.S. was not as it wasn't something that was typically taken for granted or celebrated,
Yes.
especially in 1960.
That was a very new thing with a lot of the Gold Coast, which became Ghana, and what's kind of cool is my wife Melissa and I, we just went to Ghana at the beginning of the year, and it hit me that when you see these names like Kwame Nkrumah and Patrice Lumumba, and people like that. I remember hearing these names on Malcolm X recordings when I was a kid, and like the concept of African countries finding their freedom, you know, to like a 11, 12-year-old kid, I'm like, yeah, okay, whatever. But then when you go to West Africa and then you experience this, and then you go back and see how, my wife and I have been to South Africa a couple of times, and you know, we went to Robben Island and all that kind of stuff, and you have this experience. A song like Tears from Johannesburg, which was made in 1960, when, you know, that wasn't national news yet.
Not in the U.S.
You know, not in the U.S. So this, again, proves my point that jazz musicians have been way ahead of the curve when it comes to that. You know, Nelson Mandela was not a very well-known name in 1960.
No.
Max was on it.
So I'm gonna, let's see, we have that much time, we have a lot more music, so I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit and maybe we'll
Please,
come back.
go right ahead.
So
I can't believe we only have an hour. That's cold.
So we referenced pop music and soul music and its devotion or interest in protest. And everyone knows about What's Going On by Marvin Gaye, but that was one record in Marvin's large career.
Right.
There's two men out of Philadelphia, Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff, who had hit records and also made it their business to advocate within the music. And so we're going to play a little bit of a great song. It actually one of the records that made Teddy Pendergrass a household name.
Yes.
It's Wake Up Everybody by Howard Melvin and the Blue Notes. And that's track number 9. The piano coming in.
Yep.
Wake up, everybody, no more sleeping in bed. No more backward thinking, time for thinking ahead. The world has changed so very much from what it used to be. There's so much hatred, war and poverty. Wake up all the teachers, time to teach a new way. Maybe then they'll listen.
Yeah, I know, it's great, right?
Wake up, everybody. Wake up.
So a few things to be said about Gamble and Huff. They had a label called Philadelphia International Records. And I remember as a kid, they've taken these off the reissues, but every album had a message. There was there was a little message on the back written by Kenny Gamble. Always said a message in the music.
Message in the music. That's
So
right.
they're making hit records, but they're also making albums like Ship Ahoy.
Yeah.
The OJs were the biggest act. They made an album in 1973. The title track is about the Middle Passage.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, there's another track on that album about air pollution.
Yeah.
Now, they were really canny because they'd have 8 or 9 songs, and they definitely had love songs,
Yeah.
and they definitely had dance records, but they always put their consciousness in the music. I want to read you a quote from Kenny Gamble about his philosophy. When you think of our music, it was 360 degrees of knowledge that we gave. A lot of great love songs, which is important in life, but also a lot of songs about building your community, our people. It don't mean anything if you don't leave something for the next generation.
Amen.
You grew up in Philly. Tell me about how, as a Philly musician, the Gamble and Huff legacy for you.
Well, I don't know if you know this, and I couldn't wait to surprise you, but my father was Billy Paul's musical director.
Oh, man. So you're all been, oh, man.
My father, great bassist Lee Smith, when I was born, he was on tour with the Delphonics. And then he went from the Delphonics to Billy Paul, from Billy Paul to Blue Magic, from Blue Magic to Major Harris.
Oh, he knows how to play a ballad.
Exactly. So my childhood was, at that time, Philadelphia National was set up not that much different than Motown in that there was a house band that played on all the records, and then each of their acts had the road band.
Yeah, MFSB.
Well, they were the studio band.
Right.
But my father was going out on the road with the road band. And interesting story about Gamble and Huff and sort of like the message in their music. One of the songs that pushed Gamble and Huff over the top, of course, was Me and Mrs. Jones.
Right.
And there's an interesting story about how Billy Paul's follow-up record almost stalled his career, because if you're deep in the history of R&B, the follow-up to Me and Mrs. Jones was Am I Black Enough for You?
Am I Black Enough for You? Right.
And so there's this great story that, all these people come to hear these love songs, and then like Billy Paul's like, let me play you my new single. So maybe there could have been a different way to program it in the set.
Right.
But when I think of Gamble and Huff, I mean that's my bone marrow, because my father was playing with all those cats, and I saw the OJs a lot growing up as a kid. They used to have these. I'm sure they had it here in New York, but you would often have a concert after the basketball game.
Right, yeah.
So my grandfather would take me, or my uncle would take me to see the Sixers, and then after the game was over, it'd be like the Whispers and the OJs, Stephanie Mills and like Enchantment, But Gamble and Huff really were, to me, they were sort of the central focus of the 70s, because I'm not sure the 70s gets a lot of credit for, when people think of the 70s, they think of disco mostly.
Well, and to some degree, Philly created disco.
Yeah, exactly right. Right. But a lot of songs that became like disco hits, starting with stuff like Love to Love You Baby. I mean, Gamble and Huff really stayed to the message part of the music.
I Love Music.
I Love Music, that's right.
Love Train, even, which is a song about love, but it's also about universal
going
community.
around the world, that's right. And I love the fact that even the Jacksons wound up coming to Gamble and Huff. We got somebody from Philly in there. you like from the Northeast. I'm sorry. Oh, right on. Yeah. So, I think of like, so many great message songs.
Hey, listen, they did an album called Let's Clean Up the Ghetto.
Let's Clean Up the Ghetto, that's right.
Which they took the roster of all their artists, made an album, and they made a charity record out of it.
Yes, that's correct.
So they're not as well known as the Motown people for whatever reason, but what they created and listen, it's hard to have a commercial without one of those Gamble and Huff records popping up.
Yeah.
We're running out of time. We have
That's
so
so cool.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to keep moving forward, and so one of the interesting things about talking about protest music again, people tend to now think about the late '80s as a golden age of hip hop, right?
Right.
And there's PE and there's KRS-One. I even worked on a charity record called "Stop the Violence Movement, Self-Destruction."
I remember.
Yeah. But one of the artists who's not seen in that era, she's seen as a singer-songwriter, and she's had an incredible revival, is Tracy Chapman.
That's right.
Her debut album came out in 1988, and while Fast Car was an amazing record, that album is full of very powerful songs.
Yeah.
And one of them is kind of an anthem, and we're going to just play it, and then we'll talk about it a little bit.
Yeah.
It's Tracy Chapman, number 11.
Don't you know, they're talking about a revolution. It sounds like a whisper. Don't you know, they're talking about a revolution. It sounds like a whisper. they're standing in the welfare lines, crying at the doorsteps of those armies of salvation, wasting time in the unemployment lines, sitting around waiting for a promotion. Don't you know, talking about a revolution sounds. Poor people gonna rise up, get their share. Poor people gonna rise up and take what's theirs. Don't you know you better run, 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 run.
Now, in 1988, in black music,
Yeah.
hip hop was making a statement.
Yes.
Very little in R&B was.
Yeah.
There was very little political content in R&B. When she came out, it was kind of like a black female folk singer,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
That was already a radical idea. And the fact that she wrote some great love songs on that album, but she had a very strong political point of view. She had a very hard time getting very little accepted at black radio.
Right.
At the time. And I remember, because she also was, visually, in terms of her hair and her outfit, she also was bringing, because it was a very glam era, and with black pop culture.
Yes,
And
big
she went
time.
against all of that. So she was a rebel on a number of levels, not just musically. And I just thought we wanted to include that, because sometimes she's, people talk about Fast Car, but she's been written out of a lot of the other narratives about the music.
Yeah.
And the depth of
I'm
it.
so glad you brought her up because, you know, when I think of 1988, that was, you know, I started, that was my senior year at high school. So, like, I remember, you know, Terrence Trent D'Arby.
Right. Yeah,
Milli Vanilli was about to get hot, all about Bobby and Whitney, you know, and like PE, of course, Two Live Crew. And I just remember thinking, like, we're all going to hell, you know. Ice-T, I remember when Power came out,
Oh, yeah.
you know. But then, like, you had, like, all of the Prince's Madhouse recordings that gave us some hope, you know. But when Tracy Chapman came out, I remember, you know, I had been a fan of Odetta. And so I remember, hello? Sorry. I remember having been a fan of Odetta's as a kid, so I thought of her as sort of like the
Right.
new coming of Odetta. And of course, thinking about Odetta, it was hard not to think of Harry Belafonte.
Sure.
You know, and so I've always loved what she's done as an artist, and I'm so glad she's had what, you know, they call these things comebacks, you know. But when she performed on the Grammy Awards, I was really glad to see her come back.
Absolutely. You know, speaking of hip hop, one of the things we wanted to hit on was the relationship of hip hop to the Black Lives Matter movement. And what's interesting about that is that the song that was, there were a lot of protest songs done during that era, during the pandemic and during the marching. But the song that became the one that you heard people on the street singing was one that the older generation of activists had an incredible problem with, because the original civil rights movement, as we think of it, was a very church-based, Christian-based movement. Black Lives Matter was much more organically from the streets,
Yes.
not based in the values of Christianity, but based in the values of protest and speaking truth to power. So we're just going to play a little bit of this song, and then we can talk about it a bit. And that is
Absolutely.
track number 14 on our playlist.
All's my life I has to fight, nigga. All's my life hard times like, yeah. Bad trips like, yeah. Nazareth, I'm fucked up, homie, you fucked up. But if God got us, then we gon' be alright.
Nigga, we gon' be alright. Nigga, we gon' be alright. We gon' be alright. Do you hear me? Do you feel me? We gon' be alright. Nigga, we gon' be alright. Huh? We gon' be alright. Nigga, we gon' be alright. Do you hear me? Do you feel me? We gon' be alright.
And when I wake up, I recognize you looking at me for the pay cut. Bahamas, I be looking at you from the face down. One Mac 11, even boom with the face down.
So this was a song that
Yeah.
was ringing in the streets outside my door as people protested in Brooklyn.
Right.
And it drove a lot of the old heads crazy.
I mean, I guess that's historically what always happens. You know, I'm pretty sure when Sonny Rollins and Max Roach came out with their protest music, a lot of musicians from the swing era were kind of like, "Oh gosh, what are these young boys doing?"
Right.
You know, because it was well known. You know, Louis Armstrong wasn't really a fan of bebop.
Yeah,
you
no.
know, and then people like Max and Sonny, you know, like the next generation of kind of like fusion, they were like, you know, what are these young boys doing? You know, so yeah, when Kendrick dropped that. It's par for the course that a lot of the older generation would not get on board with that. But I have I respect Kendrick so much for so many reasons. I think he's a great artist for starters. I think what he does is pretty singular, but also he's given a lot of jazz musicians a lot of spotlight.
The song is on "To Pimp a Butterfly."
Yeah, exactly, which was produced
which is
by-
actually a revolutionary album
Yes.
in history of hip hop for me.
Yes.
Because and what was interesting coming from New York, I got introduced to a whole world of LA jazz musicians, young
Yeah.
musicians, Terrace Martin.
Terrace Martin, who produced it.
And there's a bunch of other names.
Kamasi Washington.
Kamasi Washington, of course.
Yeah.
And actually, you could see after that record, the Kamasi Washington's career took off because
That's right.
So that record is one of those crucial meeting grounds
Absolutely.
between not just between generations, between generations who are connected but genre.
Yeah.
Because one of the things you're seeing in what is jazz, we can talk a bit about this, is that progressive jazz people now grew up on hip hop.
Absolutely. That's right. That's right. Well, it's like, you know, one of my best friends growing up in Philly was Questlove.
Right.
And so we kind of backed into jazz. I backed in a little more than he did. But, you know, both of our fathers were professional musicians.
That's right.
And so the first music we heard growing up was James Brown, Aretha Franklin, and then, you know, Michael Jackson, Prince, Diana Ross. That's really like our thing. So like anything that was older but great, we came to that later, you know. So most jazz musicians who are under the age of 35, hip hop is their first music. That's what they grew up on, or rock, depending on what side of the fence you grew up on. But like, I can almost guarantee you, Coltrane was not the first thing they heard that got them to music. That was probably the second or third thing that got them to the music.
And so how do you think, I mean, so when we hear Robert Glasper or some other younger, it's this, or if you go down to the Blue Note, any night you'll see some fusion of hip hop or jazz, I think. So what is, I think in a way they've kept jazz, am I overstating? Say they're keeping jazz alive for a new generation, or is that
I don't
too
know.
much?
I mean, that's always the safe thing to say.
Right.
But I think that ever since the 70s, when jazz musicians decided to, you know, have an electric fusion band, because that's what was hot at that time. And, you know, jazz musicians have always, you find jazz musicians all through history who have collaborated with pop stars.
Absolutely.
You know, we talked about Branford backstage. Does it necessarily keep jazz alive? I'll tell you a great story Branford told me. When he first started playing with Sting, you know, when Sting broke up the Police, that was huge news. And then when Sting decided to go on his first solo tour with a bunch of jazz musicians, that was the next biggest story. Like, you broke up the greatest rock band of the era to play with a bunch of jazz guys? Are you nuts? You know? And so Branford says, like, a bunch of people, you know, he had all these new fans, you know, all these people had seen him play with Sting, and like, oh my God, this saxophone player, we like him. And then when they finally came to see him play with his own band, you laughing because you know what happened. You know, so all these Sting fans go to follow Branford, and they go hear him play straight ahead jazz, and they're all like, we thought you were going to play what you played with, you know. So
So you think that's over? You think that analogy is overrated? that these
I
mix-
think so,
Okay.
yes. I think jazz stays alive because the people who play it are good at it. I think when you go see, just a few people that come to mind, you see somebody like Samara Joy.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I'm sure at some point she will collaborate with a rapper.
Sure.
But right now, when you go to see her perform, she is singing pure, straight down the pike jazz, and people love her for it.
Yeah.
You know, there's a brilliant young pianist named Isaiah J. Thompson who was playing pure, straight down the pike, straight ahead jazz, and people love him for that. So, you know, it's nice when somebody from the R&B, pop, hip hop world uses jazz musicians. That can certainly help that individual artist's career, but the genre itself, the genre needs to stand on its own legs. I mean, like, my niece now thinks I'm super cool because I play with Billie Eilish. But will that sell me more of those? I'm not sure.
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. We're rounding into there we go.
Oh, there we go.
Last section of our talk. So right now we're going to play another track from the Music Movement Revisited. That is song number 13, Rumble in the Jungle. Obviously, that was about Muhammad Ali.
That was about Muhammad Ali, yes. Yeah.
You know,
I have to give a shout out to our friend LaBob Fallon, who has sang this piece. So on the album, we use the Voices of the Flame, who are based at Abyssinian Baptist Church. And LaBob has been in that choir and sang with us. And so what's happening, LaBob? We love you. There you are.
You know, one of the questions that came from the audience, since we were talking about Sonny and talking about Max, was Charles Mingus as a protest composer. You want to talk about that a bit, fellow bass player?
Sure. I mean, Mingus is another one of those titans of not just protest music, but just the genre in general, because what I've always loved about Mingus is his music can get very abstract, but it's always rooted in the blues. His music always feels like it's about to fall off the cliff, it's about to run off the side of the road, but it never quite does. It kisses the curb. You're gonna have a lot of scratches on your car, but it's not gonna flip over, and it's because it's always rooted in the blues, which Mingus himself, his number one hero was Duke Ellington. And so I always like to say Mingus is Ellington in a hoodie.
If you ever want to read a book, if you haven't read it, that will blow your mind. It is his memoir / autobiography, Beneath the Underdog.
It's deep.
It's insane. So the politics in there and much more. One thing that came, another question I think is worth discussing is the free jazz movement. And some people, the question here is, did it predict social protest? But it seemed to be that even, we didn't really get into it too deeply, but in Max's suite of songs also was considered somewhat free jazz
Big
at the
time,
time,
yes.
as opposed to Ellington, which was very tightly constructed.
Yeah.
How do you see the free jazz movement relating to the protest?
I think it was all intertwined. I think it's important to, when you talk about the free jazz movement, you have to talk about two people. One is John Coltrane. The other one is Ornette Coleman. And yes, there's Cecil Taylor, there's Don Cherry, there's a lot of people in that movement. But I really think that Train and Ornette, particularly Train, because he had already come from a history of blues, R&B, bebop, post-bop, modal, whatever you want to call it. And then the last 2 years of his life, he got into what became free jazz. And he became so, he became like a god while he was still alive. And then that spun a whole generation of people like Pharoah Sanders, Archie Shepp, John Chakai, Marion Brown. And so when you see groups like the AACM, that was the musical version of the Nation of Islam saying we need our own nation.
Yeah.
You know, and so
a lot of these artists also began putting their music out on their own labels.
On their own labels.
Yeah.
And it was DIY to the ultimate, that's the way that the movement had preached us to kind of take care of ourselves, look out for ourselves, put out our own music. You're not under the rule of some big company, you know. Now, the issue was a lot of the great jazz musicians who were already out there doing their thing, they were like, no one can understand this. It's too abstract. It's just too weird. I mean, I understand you're being fueled by what's going on socially, but we're just not sure it sounds that good.
Right, yeah. That was a big debate.
That was a very big debate.
And Coltrane going over there really made it because he's an exemplar of
exactly
artistic greatness.
Yeah, I think when Coltrane went over there, it kind of gave them license to say, hey,
Yeah.
you know, go abstract, you know. But, you know, of course, everyone wasn't Coltrane.
No. It's funny, not funny, it's a great book that was written by Ben Ratliff about Coltrane, and half of it is about his life, half of it is about his influence.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's interesting and that came out in the book was that a lot of people who were in heavy metal and in loud guitar music
Yeah.
were very influenced by that generation of Coltrane.
Yeah.
The attack and the breathing and the energy was something
Yeah.
that
Well, Santana always credits Coltrane with being one of his major influences.
so interesting. The guitar players were really taken by his sound and the
sense.
power of his sound.
Yeah.
So we're rounding into the home stretch here, and I think we didn't get a chance to talk. We mentioned Nina Simone.
Yeah.
We didn't get a chance to talk about her too much. As an exemplar of protest music and the movement, one of the things that really struck me again, in preparing for this panel, was her as a songwriter.
Yes.
That for women, it's a long list, but she was a fantastic songwriter who was covered by other singers.
Yeah.
And I wanted to talk a little bit about one song that she wrote that was inspired by Lorraine Hansberry.
Yes.
And I'm going to give you a quote from Nina before we play the track.
That's a great quote.
So she's talking about, it's Nina Simone hanging out with Lorraine Hansberry, right? We never talked about men or clothes. It was always Marx, Lenin, and Revolution, real girl talk. And so the track we're going to say is a song that she wrote with Weldon Irvine.
Yes, that's right.
Which is inspired by the title of an unfinished play by Lorraine Hansberry. But this version is sung by Aretha Franklin. And this is track number 7, To Be Young, Gifted, and Black. That's Donny Hathaway on the organ, by the way.
Yeah.
And there's probably Aretha playing piano.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, when you're, yes, yes, when you're, thank you, Jesus, gifted and you like.
Come on, man.
Is all I need.
Okay, we'll let it go there. Because if we keep going, we'll never leave. Whew. So, let's say, like I say, there's a playlist of some of what we played here tonight, available on Spotify. A couple of tracks we didn't get to were Sonny Rollins' Freedom Suite, Nina Simone's Mississippi Goddamn. The Impressions were a winner. Curtis Mayfield was one of the great social commentary songwriters. James Brown, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. There's an excellent multi-part documentary on James Brown, Say It Loud, that's on
right.
A&E,
A&E,
that
yep.
Christian is featured in. Gil Scott-Heron's Winter in America, another songwriter who obviously did the work. And one other song we didn't get to, which is part of sort of like the avant-garde section, which is the Art Ensemble of Chicago's Fanfare for Warriors.
Yeah.
So that's like a starting point for those of you who want to go back and dig into this stuff. I just want to thank all of you for coming out and thank Christian for being here.
It was my honor to speak with the great Nelson George. Thank you, brother.